Picture this. A homeowner stands face to face with the most notorious HOA board member in their community, a woman who's made it her personal mission to make everyone's life miserable with petty violations and frivolous fines. She's pointing an accusatory finger at a beautiful rustic cabin that's been the pride and joy of this homeowner for months, claiming it violates every building code in the book and demanding its immediate demolition. But what she doesn't know, what nobody in that smug HOA knows, is that the person she's threatening happens to hold a very special credential. A credential that's about to turn her world upside down and expose just how little she actually knows about the very codes she's weaponizing against her neighbors. The moment this homeowner reveals their secret identity, the color drains from Karen's face so fast you'd think she'd seen a ghost. Her mouth opens and closes like a fish gasping for air, and for the first time in her tyrannical HOA career, she's completely, utterly speechless. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness one of the most satisfying comebacks in HOA history. A story that proves sometimes the universe has the most poetic sense of justice. But before we get to that jaw-dropping moment, you need to understand exactly how this battle began, because the setup makes the payoff even sweeter. Meet Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old software engineer who thought she'd found her slice of paradise when she purchased a beautiful 2.3-acre property in Willowbrook Estates, an upscale planned community about 40 minutes outside Denver. The neighborhood boasted tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and the kind of suburban tranquility that city dwellers dream about during their daily commutes. What Sarah didn't immediately realize was that Willowbrook Estates came with something else entirely, an HOA board that operated less like a community organization and more like a medieval fiefdom, complete with its own self-appointed queen. That queen was Margaret Maggie Thornfield, a 58-year-old retired insurance adjuster who'd moved to Willowbrook 5 years earlier and had somehow managed to insert herself into every position of authority the community had to offer. She served as HOA board president, architectural review committee chair, and landscape standards enforcer all at once. Neighbors had quietly started referring to her as HOA Karen behind closed doors, though never loud enough for her to hear. Maggie had transformed what should have been routine community management into a full-time crusade against anything she deemed inappropriate for the neighborhood character. She carried a thick binder of community covenants wherever she went, along with a measuring tape, a digital camera, and an attitude that would make a parking enforcement officer seem friendly by comparison. Sarah had initially tried to stay under Maggie's radar, but that became impossible the moment she decided to build her dream project on the back portion of her property. Having grown up spending summers at her grandmother's cabin in the Colorado mountains, Sarah had always dreamed of having her own retreat space, somewhere she could disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with nature. The cabin wasn't going to be anything massive or ostentatious. Sarah envisioned a cozy 800-square-foot structure with cedar siding, a stone foundation, and large windows that would frame the mature oak trees dotting her property. She planned to use it as a home office, a guest house for visiting family, and a personal sanctuary where she could pursue her weekend hobby of furniture restoration. But here's where Sarah's story takes an interesting turn, and where her background becomes crucial to everything that follows. You see, Sarah wasn't just any software engineer. Before she'd transitioned into tech, she'd spent 6 years working in municipal government as a certified building inspector and code enforcement officer. She held advanced certifications in residential construction, electrical systems, and zoning compliance. She knew building codes better than most contractors, and she understood property law better than many real estate attorneys. When Sarah decided to build her cabin, she didn't just wing it or hope for the best. She meticulously researched every applicable building code, zoning restriction, and HOA covenant. She pulled the original survey of her property, studied the setback requirements, and even had a professional surveyor come out to mark the exact boundaries to ensure her cabin would be positioned perfectly within all legal parameters. The HOA covenants, while extensive, actually had very little to say about accessory structures like cabins, provided they met certain basic criteria. They couldn't exceed 1,000 square feet. They had to maintain minimum setbacks from property lines, and they required Architectural Review Committee approval before construction began. Sarah submitted her plans 3 months before breaking ground, complete with detailed architectural drawings, engineering specifications, and a comprehensive site plan. The Architectural Review Committee, which consisted of Maggie and 2 other board members who rarely disagreed with her, took their sweet time reviewing the application. After 6 weeks of silence, Sarah received a terse letter stating that her application was under review and that she should expect a response within 30 business days. Those 30 days came and went without a word. When Sarah called the HOA management company, she was told that the committee was still evaluating the proposal's compliance with community standards. This is where Sarah made a decision that would later prove crucial to our story. Rather than wait indefinitely for the HOA's approval, she decided to proceed with construction anyway. But she didn't do this recklessly or out of spite. She did it because her professional knowledge told her something important. The HOA covenants contained a provision that applications were considered automatically approved if the Architectural Review Committee failed to respond within 60 days of submission. It was a standard legal protection designed to prevent committees from indefinitely stalling projects through inaction. Sarah had seen similar provisions in dozens of municipalities during her code enforcement career, and she knew exactly how they worked. So after 65 days of silence from the committee, Sarah hired her contractors and began construction. She made sure to pull all necessary permits from the county, schedule all required inspections, and document every step of the process. Her cabin was built to code, not just HOA code, but actual municipal building code, which is far more stringent and legally binding. The construction took 4 months, during which time Sarah's neighbors watched with varying degrees of curiosity and admiration. The cabin was genuinely beautiful, rustic but refined, substantial but not overwhelming. It enhanced the property rather than detracting from it, and several neighbors mentioned to Sarah that they were considering similar projects for their own backyards. But remember, we're dealing with Maggie Thornfield here, a woman who considered herself the supreme arbiter of neighborhood appropriateness. And Maggie had been watching Sarah's construction project with growing irritation. You see, Maggie hadn't forgotten about Sarah's application. She'd been deliberately sitting on it, hoping that the delay would discourage Sarah from moving forward. In Maggie's mind, the cabin represented exactly the kind of rustic nonsense that would drag down property values and attract the wrong kind of people to Willowbrook Estates. The moment Sarah's cabin was completed, Maggie began plotting her attack. The first shot across the bow came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 week after Sarah had received her final inspection approval from the county. She was enjoying her morning coffee in her new cabin, watching the sunrise through those large windows she'd dreamed about when she spotted a familiar figure marching across her backyard. Maggie Thornfield was approaching the cabin with her signature binder clutched under one arm and her digital camera in the other hand. She wore the expression of someone who'd just discovered a major crime in progress, and she was taking photos of the cabin from every conceivable angle. Sarah stepped outside to greet her unexpected visitor, trying to maintain a neighborly tone despite the obvious hostility radiating from Maggie's direction. Maggie didn't waste time with pleasantries. She immediately launched into a lecture about how the cabin was completely unauthorized, potentially dangerous, and in clear violation of multiple community standards. She claimed that the structure was too close to the property line, too tall for an accessory building, and constructed with materials that didn't match the architectural harmony of the neighborhood. Sarah calmly pointed out that she had submitted architectural plans months earlier and had received automatic approval when the committee failed to respond within the required time frame. She also mentioned that the cabin had passed all county inspections and was fully compliant with local building codes. Maggie's response was to declare that the HOA's architectural committee had never actually approved the project, and that automatic approval was not a real thing. According to Maggie, Sarah had built an illegal structure and would need to either bring it into compliance or remove it entirely. This exchange set the tone for everything that followed. Over the next several weeks, Sarah found herself on the receiving end of an escalating campaign of harassment disguised as code enforcement. First came the formal violation notices. Sarah would find official-looking letters from the HOA management company in her mailbox, each one citing different supposed violations of community covenants. One week, the cabin was too tall. The next week, it was improperly positioned. Another week, the cedar siding was declared inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetic standards. Each violation notice came with a demand for immediate correction and a threat of daily fines if compliance was unachieved within a specified time frame. The fines started at $50 per day but escalated quickly. By the third violation notice, the HOA was threatening fines of $200 per day until the issues were resolved. But here's where things got really interesting, and where Sarah's professional background began to pay dividends. Every violation notice Maggie sent contained factual errors, legal inconsistencies, or outright fabrications. The claim about the cabin being too tall ignored the fact that HOA covenants measured height from the average grade level, not the lowest point on a sloped lot. The assertion about improper positioning was based on setback measurements that Maggie had apparently taken with a tape measure from her own backyard, rather than from actual surveyed property lines. Most egregiously, several of the supposed code violations weren't actually mentioned anywhere in the HOA covenants at all. Maggie was making up rules on the fly, confident that Sarah wouldn't have the knowledge or resources to challenge her interpretations. Sarah began documenting everything. She photographed each violation notice, researched every cited covenant section, and compiled a comprehensive file proving that her cabin was fully compliant with all applicable regulations. She also started reaching out to other neighbors who'd had run-ins with Maggie over the years, and what she discovered was both fascinating and infuriating. It turned out that Maggie had been waging similar campaigns against multiple homeowners throughout Willowbrook Estates. There was the family who had been fined repeatedly for planting non-approved flowers in their front garden. The elderly couple who'd been cited for having lawn furniture that was commercially inappropriate for residential use. The single mother who'd been threatened with legal action for parking her work van in her own driveway overnight. In every case, Maggie had weaponized the HOA covenants to harass residents over issues that ranged from trivial to completely fabricated, and in most cases, the targeted homeowners had eventually given in to her demands rather than face escalating fines and the threat of legal action. But Sarah wasn't most homeowners. The more violation notices she received, the more determined she became to stand her ground. The situation escalated further when Maggie convinced the HOA board to schedule a special compliance hearing regarding Sarah's cabin. The hearing was set for a Thursday evening in November, and Sarah received official notice that she was expected to appear and present a plan for bringing the structure into full compliance with community standards. The notice also mentioned that failure to appear would result in automatic fines and that the board reserved the right to pursue all available legal remedies, including liens against the property. Sarah decided to attend the hearing, but not for the reasons Maggie expected. While Maggie was preparing to publicly humiliate Sarah and force her to commit to tearing down the cabin, Sarah was preparing something entirely different. The hearing was held in the community center's main room, with about 20 residents in attendance. Most were there out of curiosity, having heard through the neighborhood grapevine about the ongoing dispute. A few were homeowners who'd had their own battles with Maggie and were hoping to see someone finally stand up to her. Maggie had clearly prepared extensively for the meeting. She'd created a PowerPoint presentation complete with photos of Sarah's cabin, copies of HOA covenant sections, and a detailed timeline of all the violation notices that had been issued. She presented her case with the confidence of someone who'd never been seriously challenged before. According to Maggie's presentation, Sarah's cabin violated at least 8 different HOA covenants, posed potential safety hazards to the community, and set a dangerous precedent for uncontrolled development that could harm everyone's property values. She demanded that Sarah present a concrete plan for either modifying the cabin to bring it into compliance or removing it entirely within 60 days. When it was Sarah's turn to respond, she stood up calmly and began her own presentation. But instead of defending herself or arguing about covenant interpretations, Sarah did something unexpected. She started asking Maggie questions. She asked Maggie to explain exactly how she'd measured the cabin's height and to show the specific tools and reference points she'd used. She asked Maggie to identify the exact property line markers she'd used to determine setback violations. She asked Maggie to provide documentation proving that the Architectural Review Committee had actually voted to deny her application rather than simply failing to respond to it. With each question, it became increasingly clear that Maggie's accusations were based on assumptions, guesswork, and personal opinion rather than actual measurements or documented facts. She couldn't explain her measurement methods because she hadn't used proper surveying techniques. She couldn't provide committee documentation because the committee had never actually reviewed or voted on Sarah's application. But the most devastating moment came when Sarah asked Maggie to explain the specific building code sections that the cabin allegedly violated. Maggie began rattling off code numbers and technical terminology, clearly trying to impress the audience with her supposed expertise. That's when Sarah dropped her first bombshell. She calmly announced that several of the code sections Maggie had just cited didn't actually exist. Others were completely unrelated to residential construction, and the few that were legitimate had been misinterpreted or applied incorrectly. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. Maggie's face began to flush as she realized that her supposed expertise was being systematically dismantled in front of the entire community. But Sarah wasn't done yet, not even close. The tension in that community center room was thick enough to cut with a knife. You could see the wheels turning in people's minds as they realized they'd been witnessing something far more significant than a simple HOA dispute. They'd been watching a masterclass in how bureaucratic bullying actually works, and how easily it falls apart when confronted by someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Maggie, clearly sensing that her usual intimidation tactics weren't working, decided to escalate the confrontation. She stood up from her position at the front of the room, pointed directly at Sarah, and declared that ignorance of HOA rules was not an acceptable defense for violating them. She announced that, regardless of Sarah's technical arguments, the fact remained that the cabin had been built without proper authorization was clearly visible from neighboring properties and represented exactly the kind of precedent that would encourage other homeowners to ignore community standards. Then Maggie made the statement that would haunt her for months to come. With the absolute confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards, she looked directly at Sarah and said, "I don't care what you think you know about building codes, young lady. I've been enforcing these standards for 5 years and I know illegal construction when I see it. Your little cabin is not up to code. Period." That's when Sarah smiled. Not a smug smile or a gotcha grin, but the calm, professional smile of someone who'd been waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal a crucial piece of information. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out a leather folder. She opened it carefully and held up an official document for everyone in the room to see. The document had an official seal, professional formatting, and Sarah's name printed clearly at the top. "Actually, Maggie," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent room, "I think I know illegal construction when I see it too. You see, I'm a certified building inspector and code enforcement officer. I've been licensed by the state for 8 years, and I've inspected over 2,000 residential structures during my career." The color drained from Maggie's face so quickly that several people in the audience later said they thought she might faint. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. For the first time in her 5-year reign as Willowbrook's HOA enforcer, Maggie Thornfield was completely, utterly speechless. But Sarah wasn't finished. She'd been preparing for this moment for months, and she had more ammunition than anyone in that room could have imagined. Sarah explained that she'd spent the past several weeks not just documenting the violations notices she'd received, but actually conducting a comprehensive review of building code compliance throughout Willowbrook Estates. As a licensed inspector, she had the authority to identify code violations anywhere within her jurisdiction, and this community fell well within her certified area. What she'd discovered during her unofficial survey was shocking. Sarah pulled out a thick folder and began reading from a list she'd compiled. Property after property in Willowbrook Estates had serious building code violations that had been overlooked, ignored, or deliberately concealed. Electrical work that hadn't been properly permitted, deck additions that violated setback requirements, swimming pools that lacked required safety barriers, HVAC modifications that created fire hazards. But here's the kicker. Many of these violations existed on properties belonging to current and former HOA board members, including Maggie herself. Sarah revealed that Maggie's own house had an unpermitted sunroom addition that violated multiple building codes, including electrical safety standards and structural requirements. The addition had clearly been built without proper permits, inspections, or professional oversight. According to Sarah's professional assessment, the sunroom represented a genuine safety hazard that could pose risks to both the occupants and neighboring properties. The room erupted in murmurs and gasps as residents realized what they were hearing. The woman who'd been terrorizing the community with code enforcement for years had been living in a house with serious, potentially dangerous code violations. But Sarah had saved the best for last. She pulled out one final document, a comprehensive inspection report she'd prepared for her own cabin. The report, prepared using official state inspection protocols and signed with her certified inspector seal, documented that the cabin met or exceeded all applicable building codes, zoning requirements, and safety standards. More importantly, the report proved that not only was the cabin legal, it was actually built to higher standards than required by local code. Sarah had voluntarily incorporated advanced safety features, energy efficiency measures, and structural enhancements that went well beyond minimum requirements. The report also included a detailed legal analysis of the HOA covenants related to accessory structures, proving conclusively that the cabin complied with all applicable community standards and that Sarah's construction had been properly authorized through the automatic approval provision. As Sarah methodically dismantled every one of Maggie's accusations, the power dynamic in that room shifted completely. The woman who'd entered the meeting expecting to force Sarah to tear down her cabin was now facing the terrifying possibility that her own house might be condemned for code violations. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. Sarah announced that as a licensed code enforcement officer, she was legally obligated to report serious building code violations to the appropriate authorities. She explained that she'd already prepared preliminary violation reports for several properties in the community, including Maggie's house, and would be submitting them to the county building department within the next week. Unlike HOA violation notices, county building code citations carried the force of law. Property owners who failed to correct legitimate code violations could face substantial fines, legal action, and in extreme cases, condemnation proceedings that could force them to vacate their homes until repairs were completed. The irony was perfect and brutal. Maggie, who'd spent years weaponizing code enforcement against her neighbors, was about to become the target of actual, legitimate code enforcement action. As the implications of Sarah's revelations sank in, the mood in the room shifted from curiosity to outright hostility. But now the hostility was directed at Maggie, not Sarah. Residents who had been bullied by Maggie over trivial issues were realizing that their tormentor had been a hypocrite all along. Board members who had rubber-stamped Maggie's violation notices were beginning to understand that they might be legally liable for harassment if they'd been enforcing non-existent rules. Maggie, meanwhile, had gone from speechless to panicked. She began stuttering excuses about how her sunroom had been built by the previous homeowner, how she wasn't aware of any permit requirements, how surely there must be some mistake in Sarah's assessment. Sarah listened patiently to Maggie's excuses, then delivered the final blow with professional detachment. She explained that ignorance of building codes was not an acceptable defense for violating them, and that as the current property owner, Maggie was responsible for correcting any violations regardless of who had originally created them. The meeting ended with the HOA board unanimously voting to withdraw all violation notices against Sarah's cabin and to suspend any further architectural review requirements for her property. They also voted to remove Maggie from her position as Architectural Review Committee Chair, pending a comprehensive review of all violation notices she'd issued over the past 5 years. As residents filed out of the community center that night, many stopped to thank Sarah for finally standing up to Maggie's tyranny. Several mentioned that they'd been afraid to challenge previous violation notices because they didn't have the knowledge or resources to fight back. Others admitted that they'd made expensive and unnecessary modifications to their properties simply to avoid Maggie's harassment. But the story doesn't end there. The real impact of that evening's confrontation was just beginning to unfold. The weeks following the community center showdown brought a series of developments that none of the residents of Willowbrook Estates could have anticipated. Sarah's revelation had triggered a chain reaction that would fundamentally transform how the HOA operated and how residents related to each other. The first domino to fall was Maggie herself. Within 72 hours of the meeting, she received an official notice from the county building department requiring her to obtain permits for her sunroom addition and bring it into compliance with current building codes. The estimated cost of the required modifications exceeded $15,000, and the work had to be completed within 90 days to avoid daily fines. But Maggie's personal troubles were just the beginning. Sarah's promise to review other properties in the community for code violations had triggered a wave of panic among residents who realized they might have their own permit issues to address. The difference was that these residents approached Sarah directly, asking for informal consultations to identify potential problems before they became official violations. Sarah found herself in the unexpected role of community building consultant, helping neighbors understand which home modifications required permits, which improvements would actually add value to their properties, and how to work with contractors who understood proper building practices. It was a role she embraced enthusiastically, seeing it as an opportunity to help people rather than harass them. The HOA board, meanwhile, faced a crisis of legitimacy that threatened the entire structure of community governance. A review of Maggie's violation notices over the previous 5 years revealed a pattern of arbitrary enforcement, factual errors, and personal bias that exposed the organization to significant legal liability. 3 different law firms contacted residents who'd been fined by Maggie, offering to pursue class action lawsuits against the HOA for harassment, improper fines, and violation of due process rights. The potential financial exposure was enormous, not just from refunding improper fines, but from compensating residents for unnecessary expenses they'd incurred trying to comply with non-existent or misinterpreted rules. The board made a shrewd decision to get ahead of the legal challenges by proactively reviewing and refunding questionable fines, issuing formal apologies to affected residents, and implementing new procedures to prevent future abuse. They also invited Sarah to serve as a paid consultant to help review and clarify the community's architectural standards, ensuring that future enforcement would be based on legitimate requirements rather than personal preferences. Sarah accepted the consulting role, but with conditions. She insisted that all architectural review decisions be made by committee vote rather than individual authority, that residents have access to clear, written standards for all requirements, and that the community establish an appeals process for disputed violations. Most importantly, she required that any future code enforcement claims be backed by documentation from licensed professionals rather than the opinions of volunteer board members. If the HOA wanted to cite someone for a building code violation, they'd need to hire a qualified inspector to assess the situation and provide written verification of the problem. These changes transformed the culture of Willowbrook Estates almost overnight. Instead of living in fear of arbitrary harassment, residents began working together to maintain and improve their properties. The community established an informal network where neighbors with construction experience would help others with home improvement projects, ensuring that work was done safely and properly from the start. The physical improvements were dramatic. Property values in Willowbrook Estates increased by an average of 8% over the following year, as residents invested in legitimate improvements rather than expensive cosmetic changes designed to appease Maggie's arbitrary preferences. The community won 2 awards from the county for neighborhood beautification and sustainable development practices. But perhaps the most significant change was in how residents related to each other and to community governance. The HOA board meetings, which had previously been sparsely attended affairs dominated by Maggie's enforcement reports, became genuinely collaborative forums where residents worked together to address common concerns. Sarah's cabin, which had been the catalyst for the entire conflict, became a symbol of what was possible when residents stood up for their rights and demanded accountability from their leaders. Several other families built similar structures on their properties, each one properly permitted and professionally inspected, creating a cohort of beautiful accessory buildings that enhanced rather than detracted from the neighborhood's character. The irony of Maggie's situation wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who'd made a career out of harassing neighbors over trivial violations had been exposed as someone who didn't understand the very codes she claimed to enforce. Her own house, which she'd held up as a model of community standards, turned out to be a textbook example of improper construction practices. Maggie eventually completed the required modifications to her sunroom, but the experience had clearly shaken her confidence. She resigned from the HOA board entirely and largely withdrew from community activities. Neighbors reported that she seemed genuinely chastened by the experience, and several mentioned that she'd actually apologized privately for previous harassment. The broader lessons of Sarah's story resonated far beyond Willowbrook Estates. Word of the confrontation spread through social media and local news outlets, inspiring residents in other HOA communities to challenge arbitrary enforcement and demand accountability from their boards. Sarah received dozens of emails from homeowners across the country who'd faced similar harassment from their HOAs. Many asked for advice on how to research their rights, document violations of due process, and build support for reform within their communities. Sarah began writing a blog about HOA governance and residents' rights, sharing practical advice based on her professional experience and personal battle with Maggie. The blog became a resource for homeowners nationwide, offering guidance on everything from understanding covenant language to challenging improper fines to working with municipal authorities when HOAs overreach their legal authority. Sarah's professional credentials lent credibility to her advice, and her first-hand experience with HOA abuse gave her writing an authenticity that resonated with frustrated residents. 2 years after the confrontation in the community center, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her cabin. It was Maggie, looking older and somewhat humbled, carrying a small potted plant as a peace offering. Maggie explained that she'd spent considerable time reflecting on her behavior as HOA board president, and had come to understand how her approach had damaged relationships and created unnecessary stress for her neighbors. She didn't make excuses for her actions, but she wanted Sarah to know that the experience had taught her important lessons about leadership, authority, and the responsibility that comes with power over other people's lives. Sarah accepted Maggie's apology graciously, and they spent an hour talking about community governance, property rights, and the challenge of balancing individual freedom with collective responsibility. It was a conversation that neither woman could have imagined having 2 years earlier, but it represented the kind of dialogue that was now possible in Willowbrook Estates. The transformation of the community wasn't without its challenges. Some residents initially resisted the new transparency and accountability measures, preferring the old system where a single strong personality made all the decisions. Others worried that the changes would make it harder to maintain property values and community standards. But those concerns proved largely unfounded. The new collaborative approach to community governance actually strengthened property values and enhanced the neighborhood's reputation. Sarah's cabin continued to serve its intended purpose as a retreat space and home office, but it had also become something more significant, a symbol of what happens when informed citizens refuse to be intimidated by petty authoritarianism. The fact that it was built to the highest professional standards, properly permitted and inspected, made it impossible for critics to dismiss Sarah's victory as a technicality or loophole. The story of Sarah's confrontation with HOA tyranny spread beyond the immediate community, inspiring legislative discussions about HOA reform and residents' rights. Several states introduced bills requiring HOA board members to receive training on legal requirements and due process rights, while others established state-level ombudsman offices to help residents resolve disputes with their associations. For Sarah personally, the experience reinforced her belief in the importance of standing up for principles even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. She'd moved to Willowbrook Estates looking for peace and tranquility, but when faced with injustice, she'd been willing to fight back using every tool at her disposal. The cabin itself remained as beautiful as the day it was completed, a testament to what's possible when expertise, preparation, and principle combine to challenge abuse of authority. Every sunrise Sarah watched through those large windows served as a reminder that sometimes the most satisfying victories are the ones where knowledge and persistence triumph over bluster and intimidation. As Sarah often tells people who ask about her HOA battle, the most important lesson isn't about building codes or community governance. It's about the power of preparation and the importance of never backing down when you know you're right. Bullies rely on their targets being too intimidated or uninformed to fight back effectively. But when someone like Maggie encounters someone like Sarah, someone with both the knowledge and the backbone to call out abuse of authority, the results can be transformative, not just for the individuals involved, but for entire communities. The question every homeowner should ask themselves is this: when faced with petty tyranny disguised as community standards, will you have the knowledge, preparation, and courage to stand your ground and demand accountability? Because somewhere in your neighborhood, there might be another Maggie waiting to target someone she assumes won't fight back. Sarah's story proves that sometimes the most effective response to bureaucratic bullying isn't anger or frustration. It's expertise, documentation, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're talking about when the moment arrives to speak up. And sometimes, just sometimes, watching a bully realize they've picked the wrong target is the most satisfying outcome of all.